What is defunding the police? Probably not what you think it is. In the United States, Defund the Police is a slogan that supports removing some funds from police departments and reallocating them to non-policing forms of public safety and community support, such as social services, youth services, housing, education, healthcare, and other community resources. Thanks to the media, a portion of the U.S. population thinks it means people want to eliminate all law enforcement and try and fix all of society's problems with conversation, drum circles, and trips to Burning Man. Taking all the money from the local police was never in any rational person's mindset. The theory is to take some of the money from law enforcement and move it to other programs that might eliminate some of the things that lead people to a life of crime. So in a way, it is defunding the police to try a different approach. In this video, we are looking at 10 cities that did just that, and we're going to take a look and see how it worked out so far. Let's take a look. Number 10, Dallas, Texas. Dallas has been in the middle of a big discussion about how much money the police should get and how it should be spent. Now, not just Dallas, every city's been going through this. Instead of cutting police money, Dallas made a smart move in 2021. They decided to take away $7 million from the budget that is normally spent on things like overtime, extra work, and use that money a little differently. They set up a program so that when police go to certain emergency calls, they have experts like EMS and mental health professionals with them. This idea was to make sure that people get the right kind of help they need, which sometimes might not be just the police. In 2022, U.S. Senator John Cornyn introduced a bill that shaped at least part of Dallas's methods. This bill offered federal grants to pay for de-escalation and mental health response training to law enforcement agencies. That wasn't it. Dallas also made a new rule in 2020. This rule says that if a police officer sees another officer doing something wrong, like too much force, they have to step in and stop it. This is a big deal because it's about making sure the police are doing their job and treating everyone fairly. Police are not immune from mistakes going too far. They're human beings. They have an incredibly rough job, but things happen. Now, this is how it should be, and I'm sure they had certain rules about it before, and you're trained on this, but this kind of put it on paper to make sure people were following it, because now it could be a fireable offense or even a criminal offense if you don't step in. Now here's the thing. After these changes, Dallas saw their overall crime rate drop by almost 30% in 2023. However, in late 2023, they did have a surge in murders, so that ended up jumping up by 15%. So the overall crime was down, it's just their violent crime and murders jumped up a little bit. Number 9, Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City has made some changes, but here's the thing. They didn't defund themselves. They went the other direction. They've got their own agenda. In its 2021 to 2022 budget, Oklahoma City actually increased its police operation budget from $204 million to $211 million. This is what's going on in Oklahoma City with their police funding. It's pretty interesting. Instead of the usual, they're redirecting some of their budget to hire civilians for stuff like data analysis, which normally police officers would do. But that's not even the coolest part. They're throwing $300,000 into this new initiative to create an alternative force made up of mental health professionals to handle mental health crises. It's a big move, shifting away from having armed officers go to every single situation, especially when it comes to mental health problems. I've seen different studies, but I've seen that it's like 1 out of every 5 911 calls could use someone with mental health training. Then I saw another study where it's like only 10% of police officers have any significant training for dealing with mental health professionals. I'm not sure how accurate that is. I saw another study that said it was like 30% of them are. So take it for what it is. It's definitely not over 50%. Now it also seems like their approach is paying off. Remember all that talk about police needing to handle situations more calmly with less force? Well, Oklahoma City took that seriously. They rolled out a whole bunch of new de-escalation policies. Guess what? It's working. Homicides have been on the decline, dropping 20% from 2020 to 2021, then another 6.1% the following year. Even violent crime has taken a dive since it spiked in 2020. Plus, property crime is down 11% from 2021. That's pretty clear they're onto something good, and the changes are making a difference. In the last 2 years, the overall crime rate in Oklahoma City has dropped 11% in 2022 and dropped 14% in 2023. Number 8, Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. decided to shake things up a bit by defunding the police. Sort of. They passed a budget that sliced $15 million from the 2021 police funds. Most of that money was redistributed to other public safety efforts not associated with law enforcement. Their budget is usually around $500 million, and for them to take $15 million away, it was nothing. It's a big city with a lot of important things going on and a lot of people, and a lot of crime. In 2021, the DC Council voted to approve a fiscal year 2022 operating budget of $516 million for the Metropolitan Police Department, which is lower than they had in previous years, and of course their crime rate, especially violent crime rate, is through the roof right now. Seems like the nation's capital has been on a steady incline even before the whole pandemic turned the world upside down. Now, if you don't know, almost every stat from housing prices to crime rate to education has been thrown out of whack over the last few years because of the pandemic. Every city had a jump in crime. Homicide rates hit a 20-year high in 2023 in Washington, D.C., which is pretty alarming. And guess who felt that the most? Yep, you guessed it. The folks living in the poorer neighborhoods. It's like a vicious cycle. More crime leads to more police presence, but if that presence isn't exactly comforting to the community, then what's the solution? DC decided to shuffle some funds around focusing on public safety. It's a $15 million I was talking about before. Just 2 weeks ago, the DC mayor said that the crime bill may not be fully funded. Tax increases can't be ruled out. They already have some pretty steep taxes in Washington, D.C. The overall crime rate in Washington, D.C. in 2022 went up 11%, and in 2023 it went up 24.2%. Number 7, New Orleans. New Orleans has always had crime problems, especially once you get down to Bourbon Street. I'm just kidding. Bourbon Street's just about as dangerous as any other part of New Orleans, and Bourbon Street is pretty dangerous. So New Orleans decided to trim down the police budget by 8% in 2021, which amounts to roughly $16 million less for the Boys in Blue compared to the year prior. But get this, it wasn't some headline-grabbing response to the whole defund the police movement. Nah, apparently it was just more like the pandemic punching a hole in the city's wallet. They were out of money, and the city's bigwigs were quick to point out they weren't bowing to pressure and defunding their police. It was just budget shortfalls and, I imagine, a little mismanagement. And it wasn't just the police department. They cut the city's budget by like 20% that year. Now, you'd think that cut the budget by that much, the crime rate would go through the roof. No, it was already through the roof and it just kind of held steady. That is until you work your way down to the homicide rate. That went through the roof in 2022, like they were trying to break some kind of record. Now, it did take a bit of a dip in 2023, but it's still pretty high compared to most cities in the United States. So there'll be no celebrating their little dip. We're still talking numbers that would make your grandmother clutch her pearls. So New Orleans in the middle of a really tough spot. They're doing everything they can to boost tourism. Tourism is key to the success of New Orleans, but they got budget shortfalls, they got high crime. What do they cut? What do they put more money into? Crime is trending down slightly, but it's still well above almost every major city in the United States. The overall crime rate in New Orleans dropped 3% in 2022, and in 2023 it dropped 8.1%. Number 6, Norman, Oklahoma. So Norman, Oklahoma is making waves with its recent decision to defund the police. And let me tell you, it's causing quite the chatter around Norman, Oklahoma. You know why? They got nothing else to talk about. This is the type of city where introvert librarians go to have a good time. I just looked up what's going on in Norman, Oklahoma, like the news and what's happening crime-wise. There was an accidental shooting. After that, the big headline is an obituary and a story about a farmer's market. They've got a low crime rate that's going lower even though they're taking money away from the police. They're put in other places. Let me explain. It started in 2021 when the Norman City Council shuffled about $865,000 from the 2021 police budget. That sounds like a lot, but actually it's only 3.6% of their funding. $23 million is their exact budget at the time. So where'd the money go? $630,000 of it was funneled to various community development programs, which sounds pretty promising, right? The remaining $235,000 went towards hiring a new internal auditor whose job it is to keep tabs on police overtime and spending. Accountability. Now, they remove money from the actual law enforcement budget, but before you get these visions of chaos in the street, it didn't happen. The overall crime rate in Norman has been on a nosedive ever since 2012, hitting its lowest point in 2021. Property crime down, larceny down, burglary, you guessed it, it's down. Now, here's the kicker. Since about 2016, the violent crime rate had been inching up. Nothing terrible, just barely going up a fraction of a point every single year since 2016. In 2021, it plateaued, and it's been going the other direction. Just a tiny bit each year, but it is going down. Now, the overall crime rate went down 1.7% in 2022, and in 2023, it dropped another 1.5%. As I sit here and think about it, it's almost like these cities are taking on a military approach. Tanks are great, but you don't always need tanks. Sometimes you need military intelligence, sometimes you need artillery, sometimes you need infantry. So sending the police, a patrol officer, a SWAT team, whatever, for every situation doesn't make sense. I hope you get that analogy. It's working for me in my head. Number 5, Salt Lake City. In 2020, due to public pressure, the Salt Lake City Council made an important decision to change how money was spent on public safety. They decided to move $2.5 million away from the police budget and put it towards social workers instead. Additionally, $2.8 was set aside in a special account while a new group called the Commission on Racial Equality and Policing thought about the best way to use these funds. Even though they took the money away from the police, the city also increased the funding for other safety measures, like spending $1.3 million on body cameras. 3 years later, in 2023, Salt Lake City had some good news to share. Crime rates had dropped to the lowest they have been in 7 years. Violent crime, like assaults, fell by 16.4%, and property crimes like theft went down 15%. When you look at the overall crime rate, it decreased by 23% from 22 to 2023. So in reality, they didn't defund the police. They used the money to get the police some help. This shows that changing how money is used for safety, like investing in more social workers and other measures, can help make a city safer for everyone. Please don't take this like I think, the police should lose their money or defund it. Absolutely not. That's not my point. My opinion is they have an incredibly hard job and they need someone to take a little bit off their plate. The overall crime rate in Salt Lake City in 2022, it had dropped by 11.7% overall, and then in 2023, it had dropped 23%. Number 4, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis is where this whole thing started. The whole Defund the Police movement really started after the George Floyd death and subsequent riots. City leaders in Minneapolis initially sparked controversy by pledging to defund and eventually disband their police force, only to later backtrack on this promise. Instead, they opted for more moderate changes, with a $28 million cut from the police budget. A portion of these funds, around $8 million, were redirected towards alternative policing methods and mental health intervention. However, these cuts weren't exclusive to the police department. Nearly every city department faced similar budget reductions due to financial constraints. They were having budget problems even before the whole riot and George Floyd thing. Interestingly, an additional $11.4 million was allocated for police chief discretion, earmarked for unforeseen overtime and recruitment needs. Despite this, plans were set in motion to increase the police recruitment in 2022. They had quite an exodus after the riots. Over the past 5 years, Minneapolis has witnessed a concerning uptick in violent crime, marked by alarming increases in homicides and assaults. Now, downtown isn't nearly as bad as some of the other neighborhoods around downtown Minneapolis. So if you go to Minneapolis, you might be, you're downtown like a tourist, you might be, this isn't that bad. What are they talking about? Leave the downtown area. Downtown ain't great, but it's not as bad as the rest of the city. I was there 2 years ago, 2022 actually. Just there for like 3 days, no big deal, but that's kind of what I noticed. Downtown wasn't terrible. Get outside of downtown, oh yeah. Now on the other side of that crime coin is property crime. It's not that bad. It's actually gotten a little bit better over the last 2 years. So obviously with an uptick in violent crime, the first thing they do is start giving the police more money, so they're back to pretty much where they used to be, which normally hovers around $200 million a year. One thing to keep in mind about going to Minneapolis, if you look at the crime rates, your stuff is safe, you are not. The overall crime rate in 2022 jumped 10.2% in Minneapolis, and in 23 it went up 13%. Number 3, Seattle, Washington. Seattle, Washington has had some problems for quite some time. They had some riots too, and they've got a homeless situation, and they got a pretty bad drug problem up there. After the George Floyd thing and all those riots, they decided to lower their police budget by $2.5 million. This reduction amounts to about 1% of the total police department's budget. The cut primarily targeted the executive or the leadership pay within the department, including that of the police chief, as well as funding for their SWAT team and their police presence in schools. Also, the recruitment efforts took a hit. This move was part of a broader discussion around police reform in Seattle and the redistribution of resources to address community needs. In 2023, the police budget was about $370 million. That's up from $355 million in 2022. At the beginning of 2023, over 400 officers had quit Seattle Police Department or retired since January of 2020. And in 2023, they were still sitting at around 240 vacant officer positions to fill. Although Seattle faced its highest violent crime rate in 15 years in 2022, they've seen a drop in property crime. Again, it's the violent crime rate seems to be jumping up everywhere, while the property crime seems to be dropping. A lot of that has to do with how they're prosecuting and what they're arresting people for. There was a time that you could get arrested for stealing a 12-pack of beer from someplace. These days, it's really not worth the effort to the police or to the taxpayers. Processing someone and putting them in jail overnight or for a week or whatever it is, maybe going to a court case, that costs money. Over a 12-pack of beer, what's the point? I mean, they should get arrested. I'm not saying they shouldn't. It's when you start looking at the numbers, it really doesn't make sense. So Seattle did a little defunding of the police, nothing major, and the result is they've got a higher violent crime rate and a lower property crime rate. And overall crime rate is just up a little. The overall crime rate in Seattle in 2022 was up 4.7%. In 2023, it also went up 7.6%. Number 2, New York City. New York City made headlines when Mayor de Blasio announced that he would cut $1 billion from the police budget. This, as you can imagine, sent right-wing news publications into a frenzy, like a laser pointer at an indoor dog park. The newspapers and magazines in and around New York City were calling for the head of de Blasio. In the end, he only dropped it by about $500 million. Actually, $474 million was cut, or delayed, or reallocated to other forms of public safety. So that was all in like 2020 and 2021. Well, after all the Defund the Police drama calmed down and it wasn't all over the news like it was, police spending increased in New York City again in the years after, resuming its upward trend and reinstating previously paused police classes and various units. New York City had reached a historically low crime rate just before the pandemic. After the pandemic and after the lockdown, everyone's crime rate shot up, not New York City's. It stayed relatively the same. Up until 2023, the violent crime rate had continued to drop. Robbery, burglary, and property crime, that's a different story. That's been going up over the last few years. Not a bunch to be alarmed about, but enough to where it's significant. Now, if that $1 billion mark sounded outrageous, like that's a lot to take away from the police, keep in mind, back then, they were getting about $5 billion a year. In 2024, they did drop their budget only by about $89 million. That's because of budget issues, has nothing to do with defunding the police. The overall crime rate in New York City in 2022 dropped by 3.2%, and in 2023, it went down 4.6%. In case all of you don't understand this, I'm sure 99% of you do understand this, but the way they look at the overall crime rate is they take property crime and they take the violent crime, they put it in the number blender, calculator, and they come out with the overall crime rate. All right, before we get to number 1, a couple things. If you're looking to buy a house in any one of these cities, there's a link for Home and Money in the description area below. They can get you in touch with a real estate agent anywhere in the country. They've got a bunch of other cool stuff on their website. Go take a look. Now here's a few cities that didn't make this list, but I'm sure you're going to ask about them. San Francisco almost made the list. They actually added to their safety budget, which includes their police, but they did move some stuff around. They're in bad shape and they can't afford to lose one cop. Chicago would have come in at number 13. They did lower their budget for police, but that had to do with funding, nothing to do with Defund the Police movement. They did the typical thing, put some of it into community policing and social workers. Portland is another one that defunded the police in 2020 and 2021, but it didn't really have much to do with the Defund the Police movement. It had to do with budget problems. Now, out of that, they did eliminate some police units, which they felt were ineffective. They used the money from those task force to get some mental health specialists, things like that. In 2022, they increased the budget so they could get more body cams. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, Austin, Texas. At first, you're probably thinking, Texas? They lowered the police budget? How is that possible, Billy Bob? Austin ain't like the rest of Texas. They got more man buns than cowboy hats in Austin. Austin, Texas had a police budget in 2021 of $443 million. And boy, did they take that defund the police thing to heart. Austin voted unanimously to cut or relocate $150 million from their 2021 police budget. The largest changes including a straight $20 million cut to the department. After that, they got in a drum circle, had hallucinations of John Lennon, and shifted $45 million to the Reimagined Safety Fund. And then they moved $80 million to civilian agents who would replace some of the police functions. They also started redirecting 911 calls to mental health professionals who could help people instead of responding with force. Now, did it affect the crime rate? Not at all. Austin's crime rate, all the way around, violent and property crime, has been dropping since it peaked in 2008. And that continued straight through 2023. Austin is still one of the safest of the 30 largest cities in the United States. The overall crime rate in Austin, Texas, in 2022 dropped 5.3%, and in 2023, it dropped 4.6%. In conclusion, even though several cities defunded the police to some degree, police budgets have increased overall since the George Floyd, BLM, and Defund the Police movement started. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day, and be nice to each other.